Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
Hey gang, welcome to Weird Web Radio. I'm your host, Lonnie Scott, and welcome to Season 5. I'm so happy that we are still rolling along, and I'm really happy that you're here to listen. This episode features Dr. Mathias Nordvig. Mathias has been one of the most helpful and influential people, I think, on modern heathenry, since he's also an academic, a PhD holding person with Nordic Mythology, and comes from Denmark himself, raised and grew up as a heathen, and his perspective with his in-depth knowledge through academics as well as a lifetime of practicing, the reconstructed and reimagined faiths of heathenry, of which I also do, has been an incredible boon to everyone that he shares that wisdom and his knowledge with the world freely. He's also been teaching Viking studies, Norse mythology, Scandinavian folklore, and Arctic culture at the University of Colorado at Boulder since 2015. He runs a YouTube channel called the Nordic Mythology channel, along with its corresponding website, NordicMythologyChannel.com. He also has a podcast with Daniel Farrand, the co-owner of the clothing company Horns of Odin, called the Nordic Mythology Podcast. I happen to be a huge fan of that show. I highly recommend it. In addition to all of that, Dr. Nordvig works with musicians, visual artists, all to create inspiring music and art about the Viking Age and Norse mythology. Most recently, Dr. Nordvig has published the book Norse Mythology for Kids, a retelling of Norse mythology for children ages 8 to 12. And that all comes from the About the Author section of his brand new book, Ásatrú for Beginners, a Modern Heathen's Guide to the Ancient Northern Way. I had the honor and the privilege to review this book before it hit publication, and I can say that it is absolutely worth being added to every modern pagan and heathen shelf out there, regardless of your skill level or in-depth of knowledge. I think it's got a lot in there that is great for beginners. Clearly, it's right there in the title. It says it's for beginners, but Mathias challenges enough of those status quo held thoughts and notions just to make you think differently about things that may not be as true to history sometimes as we think it is, and also just to challenge your own personal growth and make you explore more, expanding your mind and your knowledge into the things that we consider to be heathen. I would like to remind everyone that each and every guest goes into what I call the bonus portion. Bonus audio is the extended interview section where we explore a little more personal, a lot more weird, and kind of morbid at times, and just to get more out of the guest. You can access the archives of all of those extended portions and the one that includes Dr. Nordvig simply by joining the Patreon membership at patreon.com/weirdwebradio, or go to weirdwebradio.com and click Join the Membership. Beyond that, the only exciting news I've got for you is that all episodes are now available on YouTube, so I can truly say Weird Web Radio is available everywhere where you get your podcasts, and it feels good to be able to finally say that. Enjoy the show out there. Stay weird, my friends. And we are recording. Mathias Nordvig, welcome to Weird Web Radio. It is really, really cool to have you here. Thank you for taking the time out of your day.
Thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure. I'm thrilled to be on.
All right, and I promise, folks, I did not pay him to say that.
That's true. You didn't.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that I've got plenty of people who already kind of know who you are. I've shouted from the mountaintops for quite a while now about the Nordic Mythology Podcast that you do with Daniel, and I think it's a fantastic resource out there for not just people who are interested in Nordic mythology and the culture and the things around it, but even for modern practicing heathens, as we sort of talked about before we started recording.
Um,
Yeah.
it's work like yours that I think helps inform anybody who wants to be a modern practicing heathen to be more inspired by what may have actually happened instead of always looking to the past with these rose-colored glasses.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. I mean, so the way that the Nordic Mythology Podcast sort of came into existence was actually that Daniel and I found each other because he owns the company Horns of Odin, and they have clothing lines, and they use non-white models from time to time, um, and so all of a sudden he was receiving backlash on social media for that, and then he and I started talking and decided, well, why don't we try to offer some quality material for all the different kinds of people out there who are interested in this stuff? Nordic mythology, the Viking Age, whether they are, just, uh, reenactors, or they have some scholarly interest, or they're modern practicing heathens as well. So, yeah, that's how we sort of came into existence, and we try to offer, um, the approachable information, or we try to offer the information in an approachable way, and we also try to, um, you know, always make our listeners aware that this is complicated material to actually get a grasp on, and yeah, it's not you can't really just go with that rosy picture, that we otherwise guys get in those like romanticized versions, right?
Right. Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're born and raised a Dane, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I was born in Denmark. I lived part of my childhood in Greenland as well, but mostly lived in Denmark.
Okay. So, I in America, when we're growing up, we learn the most PC, watered down, love our founders kind of version of American history, especially around the Revolution and the Civil War and such.
Mm,
That it's not until many people get into college or study on their own that they discover the finer, uglier points and things like that.
right.
But growing up in Denmark, the rich history of your country is much longer and stretches back to that very Viking age.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, out of my own curiosity, when you're growing up in your school system and you're learning about the Viking age, uh, how is it taught to you? I guess as a culture, I'm trying to get an idea of maybe versus how we learn about it in a footnote versus
Right.
something that's really a deep part of your own history.
So, the Viking Age takes up probably as much space in our curriculum, in primary school, as the Revolutionary War, and the Founding Fathers, and the Civil War does here. That's very much, in so many ways, and kind of oddly, our foundation story, right? This is what we go back to as where we became the Danes that we are today, even though that's 1,000 years ago, and a lot of things have happened in between. So in many ways, the way that they teach the Viking Age, in at least in primary school in Denmark, and elsewhere in Scandinavia too, is also in very much an idealized version of it. You don't get into the critical material until you come into high school. That's where you start learning about the basics of historical methods and criticism.
How deeply is because I know Denmark is a Christian nation, much like the rest of the Western world.
Hmm.
But how much is those ancient or medieval Nordic practices of religion that we refer to today as heathenry?
Hmm.
how much is that celebrated or recognized in Denmark?
So it's a curious double-sided thing. Just to give you the listeners a little background, I have been raised as a heathen myself, and I identify as such myself. You can always get into the technical details. Are we talking Ásatrú? What do you want to call it? All that stuff. But let's just say heathen, and that's that. And in Scandinavia and in Denmark in particular, we have a national church. So Norway just recently changed their constitution so that they don't have a national church any longer, but they used to have the same system as us, with a national church that is tied to the royal house. Remember that we're actually monarchies and not republics. we do have parliaments, but we're monarchies the same way as England is it, and that means that we have like Denmark has the Ministry of Ecclesiastical Affairs attached to the government. This is in some ways a religious institution. That's how it was created in the first place, but now also has sort of more of like a historical role. The majority of the population are Protestant Christians, and the members of the what is called the People's Church. I know that might sound funny to American ears, but yeah, we have a People's Church, and this church is involved in teaching Christianity in primary school. So we go to Christmas sermons and such things as part of school in Denmark. So we actually get a Christian teaching and upbringing through the public school system.
So there's no separation of like church and state idea that ever hit Denmark.
Well, there was the idea did hit Denmark, but we have sort of like worked around it. So I know that this sounds very like, oh wow, that sounds like a northern Iran kind of thing.
No,
I mean,
not quite.
You know what I mean? Like, there's like, whoa, that's a curious confluence of institutions there. But in Denmark, it's not experienced as something that has a lot of impact on your personal freedom, your freedom of religion, or any of those things. Like you're free to believe whatever you want, and you can also be recognized as another kind of religion if you want to, and have enough members. There are certain requirements that you have to fulfill. You have to have a creed, you have to have rituals, and such, and then you can put in a petition with the government. Then they will recognize you as an official religion, and that has happened for Ásatrú and heathenism. I think it was in 2004 that Ásatrú was recognized as an official religion in Denmark. It was earlier in Norway and earlier in Iceland, obviously, and also a little earlier in Sweden, as far as I remember. But in all the Scandinavian countries, this belief is now an official religion that has the right to bury the dead and marry people and all of these things, which especially in Denmark, takes place in context of religion. Like it is the official business of the People's Church to make sure that people get buried and married and all that stuff. So when you have another religion, they have to work with the official Protestant Church of Denmark to do that, actually. But,
that's interesting.
Yeah, and ideologically, I'm not particularly a big fan of that. But culturally, no. But culturally, it's not a problem, if you ask me. It's obviously the biggest religious minority that we have in Denmark is Islam, and the Muslims have their own burial sites and mosques and everything. So other religions that are perhaps more well established than the heathen faiths, they seem to work out perfectly in all of that. So yeah, I think it's fine. It's
Yeah.
weird, but it's fine.
Yeah. You said in there that you grew up heathen,
Yeah,
and I know I've heard you talk about that before on, I think, one of your videos on your YouTube channel,
yeah.
interviewing someone else. And I've always kind of wondered, like, what that meant for you. What did that look like growing up heathen? What was your family like?
Well, so I mean, originally it was, and this, I think there's a cultural difference between how people are heathen here in North America and how a lot of people, at least traditionally, have been heathen in Scandinavia. And that cultural difference is that, here it is very much perceived as a faith, a religion. It's something you practice in different ways. Whereas to many heathens in Scandinavia, it might be a belief that you have, but you don't actually have to like act upon it. You don't need to go do rituals or anything like that. But but uh, for many people, and this is both like Iceland, I think is the prime example where many of those who say that they're Ásatrú, they are it for cultural reasons. So for them, it's the stories that matter more than going out and doing blots and all of that stuff. So like what I grew up with was a lot of stories about the Nordic gods, uh, all the sagas, the ancient heroes, um, all the Viking history, right? And um, so when I was 17, my father died, and that was in what 2008, 2009, around that time. Um, no, not 2008. Sorry, 1998. I was just trying to make myself 10 years younger there. um, and that's when my mom decided to enroll us in the national Ásatrú organization in Denmark. And so we were members there for a while, and since then I've just sort of like been part of that whole environment. I haven't, retained my membership there because of political reasons and a lot of other things. I think there's a lot of heathens in all of Scandinavia who aren't actually members of any national organizations or any particular groups, but practice, in their families instead.
Yeah, I
Which,
think that's
yeah,
common. I think it's a great deal more common even here than
yeah,
as well as there.
and that gives you such a big problem in terms of like trying to actually put numbers on how many are there out there. And aside from the whole problem with defining yourself as like heathen and Ásatrú out there, like so many people try to avoid that terminology too.
Yeah. You mentioned in there that your father died when you were 17,
Mhm.
and my father died uh, 4 years ago now, and I know what it's like to walk in the world. Like, I had a complicated relationship with my dad anyway. He was never part of a heathenry or anything, but he was a Freemason, I guess.
Mm.
But I heard this in an interview once when Cal Fussman was talking to Tim Ferriss about getting an opportunity to interview Mikhail Gorbachev in the 80s. And
Yeah.
he was only given like, 3 minutes or something. And he thought, in this parade of reporters, how do I get more time with this guy and make
Mhm.
myself stand out? And when you said that, I remembered it immediately, and I feel like I just want to ask you what Cal asked Mikhail Gorbachev. You're probably thinking, what the fuck was that? Yeah. What do you think the most important lesson is you learned from your father?
Wow, wow. Okay, so first of all, I have to say that I'm honored to like be asked the same question as Gorbachev.
I just think it's a
Oh,
fantastic reflection, especially when we get into these deeper subjects. Um,
yeah.
when
No,
we've lost a parent like
absolutely. So my father was probably the one in of my parents that was the least um, identifying with anything formalized heathen or anything like that. But I think actually what I've what I learned from him um, was more of a heathen mindset than from anyone else when it comes down to it. You know, this sort of like animistic approach to the world. Um, he would say things like, uh, "Don't don't ever when you're boiling water, don't ever use hot water from the faucet. Use cold water because if you use hot water, you take the soul out of the water that you're going to boil." It's just like that's
Yeah,
it might sound like weird and silly, but it's like that's an animistic way of thinking about the world. That
yeah,
the water would have soul. So that's probably what he has taught me. Like that's probably one of the biggest lessons about life. That the
that's
world
really
around you. Yeah,
yeah.
I thought it was
I
really
like
cool.
that. I really like that. So thank you for sharing that. That was really cool.
Yeah,
So talking about Norse mythology, something that is I think a prevalent misstep or misconception, I guess, on people's part entering heathenry, entering any alternative religion, in the realm of paganism. But
hmm
well, we're focused on heathenry today. So there seems to be this idea that mythology equates religion.
yeah.
You see where I'm getting with this? That
hmm
there that people. How much do you think we should take ideas from the surviving mythology to identify perhaps the nature of the gods and goddesses, or how to interact in the world as heathens?
Right. Yes. Yeah, that's a very good question.
It
Um,
is a big question. Yeah.
it is. Actually, so let me just turn to my book here.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah,
Ásatrú
name
for
the book
beginner.
first. Yeah, Ásatrú for beginners.
Yeah, so yeah, it's coming out in the beginning of September, September 6th, I think. It will be available for purchase on Amazon. Ásatrú for beginners: A Modern Heathen's Guide to the Ancient Northern Way. And the thing is, the reason that I'm plugging it like this right now is that I think my answer to you is in that book, actually, because I have a list of different gods that are important in different ways, some more than others, and so on. And much to my publishers or my editors' in dismay, I have refrained from giving too much information on the gods in general in there. Writing about Odin, I debunk or try to at least debunk some of the most prevalent myths about him that I find as misconceptions based off of modern interpretations or Snorri's interpretations. Snorri Sturluson as one of the primary sources to modern heathenry, the Icelandic chieftain who wrote Edda in 1220, right? He's our primary source, and he mixes in a lot of Christianity, and that has, of course, precipitated into modern times. But aside from debunking some of those myths that are based off of a very obvious Christian interpretation that happened 800 years ago, I I try to um, not impose too much of my own interpretation of what the gods are, because I feel that it's important that if you are a modern practitioner, you should develop your own relationship to the gods. And yeah, of course, explore what other people have said. Um, and that goes for contemporary individuals as much as historical individuals, like aforementioned Icelandic chieftain. Um, but yeah, go out and see if you can find Odin in a tree rather than in a book. That's how I would put it. Um, so yeah, no, in that sense, like what I'm saying is actually informed a lot from the mythology, But on the other hand, this literal interpretation of like I can find this instance and this and that of some kind of obscure poem from the medieval period. That's probably less valuable than that intimate relationship that you can get with the deities as you work with them in ritual.
Hmm. Yep. I like how you said, "Go find Odin in the tree instead of Odin in the book." That one
Thanks.
alone's worth the price of admission, folks.
That's a point to me right there.
I would like to remind people, as we're speaking today in August, that your book is available for pre-order already on Amazon. So I'm not sure
Yeah.
if this episode will be out after it's already available and ready to ship or not, but that's no excuse. Whether you're listening to this the day it comes out or in the archives, if you don't have the book, please go get the book.
Thanks.
Yeah. Something else about mythology that I see come up a lot, and we'll use Odin as an example. And maybe this is one of the myths you chose to debunk. I don't know. I haven't read the book yet. This even flared up recently on the Troth email list about the story about Odin eventually raping someone in order to produce a child that's going to avenge Baldur's death. And then you get people who say Odin is a rapist, and now I can't have anything to do with Odin, or people who have anything to do with Odin.
Right. Yeah. So I understand the people who take that position. That has something to do with their what they feel is their moral integrity,
Right.
and what they bring into their lives, and that's for them to decide. Um, Speaking as a mythologist, and then now I put on the hat of like I am also an academic in this. Um, this story of a god raping a human princess, which is the case with this one, um, or a god raping a sort of like in a mythological sense lower standing being, is very common. And I would remind you that this very similar stories exist in Native American mythologies as well. Coyote does the same thing, um, and in some of these cases, he does it simply just out of desire and lust, not for any greater purpose. So I mean, this is a very common theme in mythology, and when we go back to like what is mythology, how do we use mythology? Mythology was created by humans for them to understand their own world. It wasn't created. Nobody ever told mythological stories to set up universal rules on morality and ethics. That comes later on, for so many of these belief systems. So, when what that we can even talk about in terms of like Greek mythology, you can talk about a moralistic turn where the Hellenic thinkers in ancient Greece start, holding the gods accountable for various morals that they in their current human society uphold, right? And it's that I understand where it's coming from, but it's also a little weird, actually, from a historical perspective at least.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So, well, from my perspective, as I said, I have sympathy for people who make those kinds of decisions, but it just personally does not make any sense to me, because the story is more likely a story that should be taken as a story that we can learn something from in in the specific context of the story itself, or in the context of the story being part of a greater whole of narratives about Odin and what kind of figure he is. We risk demonizing him the same way that happened to this Satan figure that exists in these various iterations of Christianity, right? And ultimately, what it comes down to is taboo, right? What is taboo in our world? What is things that we can't touch? And that also means what are things that we can't talk about? And the problem, one of the major problems, if you ask me, especially nowadays, is that we're running into problems with not being able to talk about certain problems in our world, if that makes sense.
That does make sense.
As we keep canceling certain things out and saying this is anathema. It doesn't have to be religion. It can be, social circles. It can be politics. It can be so many different things. If we can't talk about it, then we can't solve the problem. And I think we know this very well from many aspects of contemporary politics. Like the things that aren't being talked about are also the problems that aren't being solved. So in that sense, I think it's not a a useful way to approach mythology or a deity for that matter.
Right. So maybe we're spoiling your book when I ask. You say you debunked several myths with Odin as an example. What's a popular myth about Odin that you've decided to tackle and say bullshit?
Yeah. Odin as the Allfather, and now I'm probably pissed off half of the listeners. Yeah. So, Odin as an Allfather is not impossible in a pre-Christian context, but it is also very much questionable. And if we want to get technical, we can talk about the word Allfather and how it's being transposed from the original poetry into Snorri Sturluson's Edda. If Odin was an Allfather in a pre-Christian context, he was definitely not the Allfather that you could read about in Snorri Sturluson's Edda. The Allfather in Snorri Sturluson's Edda is a sort of watered down heathen version of God. And that is very clear when we see that Snorri Sturluson tells us that Allfather lives in this place called Gimle in heaven, where he gathers all the righteous ones. I mean, it's literally the word righteous that is being used here. That Allfather is God. It's not Odin. And Snorri Sturluson, as I mentioned, was a Christian who wrote this stuff down. It was very much his intention to represent Odin in this way, in that portion of Edda, because he does it. He imposes two things, two very well known interpretive modes in mythology. First of all, he uses euhemerism, which basically purports that the gods are in fact just humans who managed to trick other humans into believing that they were gods. And secondly, he uses Christian theology to interpret, non-Christian mythology, and that creates that image of the Allfather who sits there on his throne and sort of like acts like a cartoon version of God. And that was very much not his intention to represent Odin as a cartoon version of God. And so I spent a little time debunking that. Now, if I want to say that if you want to still believe that Odin acts as an Allfather or functions as an Allfather for you, go right ahead. I'm not criticizing anybody's beliefs or worldview. But the historical context is important because that also then tells you that you have other alternatives And that's, I think, is one of the major points about being heathen in the first place, that we have other alternatives than what some dude with a tall hat says somewhere, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's something that gets lost, and it comes up in my conversations a lot. When I teach study groups, or if I have friends who are pagan already getting more interested in heathenry, I think people forget that the period of time when people were practicing what we would call heathenism stretched over a vast area of Europe and had many local variations.
Hmm.
I've even said that it probably was possible to go to one place and see a particular god worshipped or honored, and that god not even be in the minds of a village not too far away.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and that's also, in scholarship, we talk about different ways of being a believer. There are social reasons for believing in a certain way. There are psychological reasons. There are geographical reasons, cultural reasons. There's so many different reasons that a belief turns out in a certain way, for a person or a group or a whole society. And that's, I think, the lesson from any religion is that it's always going to change and evolve, um, based on a lot of other factors that are present in a society. And just think about all the different versions of Christianity out there. If there was just one
Right.
truth to that, why are there so many different? Yeah, no, I'm not going to get into that.
Yeah, that's usually an example I bring up. You've got here you have a religion that's a couple thousand years old that uses one book, and
Yeah, exactly.
they can't agree. So yeah, good luck to the rest of us, right?
Yeah.
Um, I don't want to make this all about gods, and I really don't think, even in mythology and in the reimagination of heathenry today, I don't think gods are necessarily supposed to be the central point. You brought up animism earlier
Mhm.
when we talked about your father, and that really cool way that he was explained, just like water, as an example.
Mhm.
Um, I've personally found, as I've gotten older and expanded my reading out to more, academic reading and learning more about concepts like animism, that I think that is more at the heart of perhaps a heathen past than it's often given credit for. What would you think?
I agree completely. Um, when it comes to this idea of, like, the difference between, like, spirits and gods, lower mythology, higher mythology, you have to consider that much of that stuff has been invented throughout the last 300 years. In the sense that, it's not like, the idea of high gods, for instance, hasn't existed for thousands of years. It definitely has, but the way that we, as modern human beings, think about these things, has very much been defined by Western scholars of religion, over the last 3 centuries, and they usually come from a very Christian background when they are talking about these things.
Yeah.
And it is very likely that these Scandinavians, 1500 years ago, never really thought about, gods and spirits as separate entities, that they could all be, the same things. It is 100% certain, if you ask me, that these people, would have looked at their world, and then they would have looked at that tree over there and experienced that tree as inhabited by some kind of spirit. Um, a rock as well. I mean, we see that all over the mythology too. We have the dwarves that live in the rocks and in the soil, and so on. Those are aspects of animism, and we still have it today in Scandinavia. We still have all our folk tales, right, that talk about these beings in the world around us. That lake over there is populated by a troll. That mountain over there has some troll living there. There are the Hunter people over there, there are the elves over there, and so on and so on. I mean, this is still in some ways part of our worldview, and even to the extent that it's been institutionalized too. So now I started this out by talking about how we have an institutionalized churches and all that stuff. We also have institutionalized animism, actually, in a sense, um, because the formalized reverence for history and the historical landmarks that we have that go all the way back to the Stone Age, typically as burial mounds. And all of that stuff is protected by pretty hardcore laws that make sure that you can get fined pretty heavily if you have, for instance, a Bronze Age burial mound on your ground and you tamper with it at all. You can be fined pretty severely. And it's also interesting to see many of these old features of the landscape. They've been turned into modern monuments in different capacities throughout Scandinavia. And when damage does happen to a grave mound, we see that sometimes. It's usually some kind of like industrial farmer who, either willfully or by accident, damages a grave mound. And when that hits the media, uh, people get so angry, right? And we all know the story about the road that was redirected because of the Elf Rock in Iceland.
Right.
Um, and that's another example of how Scandinavians still think of their world in animist terms. When you actually start digging into that Elf Rock, it's a little more chill than the stories that are told to tourists, but uh, it's still an example of that, right? So these ways of thinking about the world still exist in those cultures in Scandinavia, even though that the Scandinavians are in many ways some of the most modernized people on the planet. So
Hmm.
it's a duality in that sense.
Yeah, I I think animism is more of a natural instinct for humanity. At least the humans I've always interacted with and seen. They may not recognize it, but you can see it when, like, especially if you have children, uh,
Yeah,
how naturally they see some inherent nature in an inanimate object, or the tree or the lake or the river, as you were saying. They want to talk to the dog and the cat as though they're going to talk back.
absolutely. Yeah. No, that I think it's a very natural way for humans to approach the world. And if you start digging into like evolutionary aspects of that, um, what we typically find is that it actually quite often has a component that ensures survival in one way or another. Um, that's This is sort of on the fringe of what I you know wrote my PhD dissertation on. I wrote about the relationship between Norse mythology and the volcanic landscape in Iceland, and in many ways you could actually interpret several myths as animist stories about volcanology in Iceland.
Yeah, the your it was something along those lines. Jackson Crawford was interviewing you about, is how you even showed up on my radar like a couple years ago or whatever it was. Uh, was
Yeah,
talking about the relationship between those things with him. I thought that was really cool.
yeah,
I'll make
no,
I'll make sure to stick a link in there for that video if it's still on YouTube.
yeah, yeah, cool, thanks. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's actually in the field of Norse mythology and and study of Norse mythology, it's not something that my colleagues are particularly thrilled about, these interpretations, because they smell a little too 19th century for them. But if you look again in terms of like comparative mythology across global perspective, you can actually see these types of stories in so many different cultures that have lived with volcanoes for longer periods. Active volcanoes in the vicinity of humans actually quite often become part of like a foundational fabric of society. And of course, like our reference point here is Hawaii as a great example of that. But it happens in so many other places too.
One thing that comes up in conversation a lot, especially with a particular friend of mine, and she was really like bugging me to get this question in, and I wasn't sure how to shape it based on our conversation. But she's been watching the Vikings TV show and getting ideas from there, and of course we have those conversations too. And but the question keeps coming up: if Scandinavians up through the Viking period remain practicing their sort of religions and magical practices and so on so much longer than the rest of Europe before they end up converting. It seems almost confusing sometimes when you think about it, like how accepting do you think the Viking period during the conversion really was towards Christianity?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So there's a couple of things to unpack here.
Yeah, it's an ugly way of asking a question. Yeah.
So it's interesting. We talk about the Viking Age, and heathens are fascinated with the Viking Age because the Viking Age is sort of like the end time of heathenry. This is where Scandinavians become Christians. For my home country, we have like the Viking Age spells the what we literally call the birth certificate of Denmark, right? The yelling stone, that's spelled Jelling. That was raised by Harold Bluetooth, that says straight up, well, Harold Bluetooth goes, I Christianize Danes, period. That's from 965. That's in the middle of the Viking Age. So all the Viking stuff sort of like, if you're interested in the heathen part of that, it fizzles out, right? And the Norwegians are no better. They were also Christianizing heavily in the late part of the 900s. The only ones who seem to be holding out are the Swedes, right? They are only formally Christian, I guess, in 1080, and they still have pagan uprisings in the beginning of the 1100s. So, it's the interest in the Viking Age is curious in that sense, because that's where we're sort of like losing the religion. But going back to like before that, right? We have to think of first of all, I would encourage people to think about Christianity and Christianization in another way. Christianity does not erase the previous culture that existed, and Christianity, the point where you convert to Christianity is not the point where you stop doing the things, or partly the things that happened before then. I mean, a great example is that celibacy was never really a big thing in the Scandinavian churches. So it's like the idea of like the celibate Catholic priest, for instance. Also, celibacy in and of itself as part of being a Catholic priest was also not necessarily always just the way that you were a Catholic priest. I mean, I can't remember exactly when this becomes a mandate for Catholic priests, but this is just to make you think a little bit about how we usually think about, oh, this is a priest, this is what a priest does. That's not necessarily what was the case in, say, 1100 Scandinavia. And the same with a Christian person and somebody who believes in God and all that stuff. They can still be, at least to some extent, be putting out, porridge for the house elf and all that stuff. And that's what Scandinavians were doing in the 1100s, and that's what the English were doing in the 800s, I guess, and the 900s too. Like, um, just because they start believing in God and going to church and all that stuff doesn't necessarily mean that they leave all the other stuff behind. It does mean that Odin is equal to the devil now, but that's Odin, right? So now we understand we shouldn't go give sacrifices to Odin. Okay, fair enough. No, we're not gonna slit the throat of a bull or something in honor of Odin, and splash the blood around and whatever they did. But that doesn't mean that all the other components uh, are necessarily gonna go away immediately, and that's we can very easily see that in the laws. The laws throughout the 1100s in Scandinavia in particular become harder and harder on these menial things that we today associate with witchcraft. So that it's a process where over time they make sure to weed it all out, and you know I don't think they even really succeed. You know, in the 1700s. And this is not just for Scandinavia, it's also other parts of Europe. In the 1700s, they still have to like go out and be mean priests to people here and there, um, because they keep doing stuff that they don't like, right? And it's some of it. In some cases, it's not necessarily a matter of like a tradition that survives through 1,000 years. In some cases, it's also new things that people start inventing on their own. Going back to this animistic perspective, right? You know, with this way of thinking about the world in terms of animism, well, you also get ritual, right?
What is one of the biggest mistakes you see happening in modern heathenry and Ásatrú today that if you could correct it, you definitely would?
Oh wow,
That's a reaction I like.
Well, I mean, I have and will always think that the biggest mistake that anybody could make with heathenry is to tie it to the white race and all of that nonsense. That no thanks. It's please be inclusive instead, because there's a first of all, if and this is what I always say to Americans who bring that perspective to me. It's like, oh, I have so and so much this and that DNA from Scandinavia, and it's all about preserving the white race or something like that. And it's like, dude, you're establishing a hierarchy, right? A hierarchy of race in that regard, with heathenry uh, as your way of legitimizing that. And in that context, you're always gonna, you know, uh, you're gonna lose out. You're gonna lose out. Um, it's not a valid way to approach gods, if you ask me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That is one of the biggest stains on American heathenry.
Yep.
Ben Wagner and Lauren Crow do a podcast called Heathen History, and they've been exploring the earliest, beginnings of heathenry as it stewed up in the Western world, and the rebuilding of such, and how these ideas kind of inserted themselves in from the very beginning. And it's up to us, especially in America, to rid ourselves of that ideology. So,
Absolutely.
I think it makes people very happy to hear that you're on that side.
Absolutely, 100%. And the important thing is also, and this is a lesson that we may learn from the National Socialists of Germany, right? They were all about their culture and in a particular fascist interpretation, but nonetheless they at least said that it was all about German culture and all that stuff. And what happened, guys? Well, you lost the legitimacy to actually practice your culture um, from all of that nonsense. So that's the point that I would like to drive home to anybody who's like skeptical about what I'm saying right now. Guys, if you are sitting out there thinking that this is about the white race or something like that, you have to consider that if you go out and commit atrocities in the name of your culture, in the name of your race, and all of that stuff, you lose legitimacy to actually, you know, be like sagas. Think Odin is cool. All of these things. And I had plenty of conversations with people who could not understand why I would be, a modern human being and, you know, uh, practice heathenry and be into Norse mythology and all that stuff, because for them, all this stuff was associated with racism. And they could not make those two things work. Like this person that they're talking to, and the fact that Norse mythology for them is associated with racism, thanks to those individuals out there who use it for those purposes, right? Then you get the question like, why? I mean, I think I was in high school. One of my friends asked me, "Why do you practice a Nazi religion?" And I'm like, "It's not a Nazi religion, right?" But that's what we risk, when we allow people to use it for those kinds of things.
Absolutely agree. I just don't feel. I don't know. Those concepts of race and racial identity and all that sort of thing, I just don't think is something. Even if it were something that were held culturally important at any point in history, why would you want to? Why would you want to bring something awful like that into your life today? You have no
Exactly.
idea how much you miss out by othering people like that.
Yeah.
And go back to, you honestly think if Odin's walking and wandering the world that he isn't going to gain wisdom from anywhere that he can get it?
No, exactly right. No, why would he hang out in your basement? Like,
Right. I think he can
no,
afford something other than the frozen burrito, Nazi. Yeah.
no, I
Funny.
don't even I don't even believe in the concept of race. It's there's no scientific reason to talk in those terms. No, so yeah, I think that would probably be, in my opinion, the biggest mistake any heathen
Yeah,
could make.
I agree. I think it's really important to shine a light on that, and thank you for doing so. Um, I've got some questions from Facebook from fans of the show, and not too many of them. Some of them I knew I was going to weave in anyway, so I've sort of gone through that. One thing that came up was from Sean from Alberta, Canada. He wanted to ask you. See, I've got to read how he says that. He says it would be interesting to learn what his thoughts on reconstructed magical practices are, and if the traditions he learned or witnessed culturally differ greatly from what he sees in North American circles. And then he adds, does he even think the gods care about that?
I think the gods appreciate any genuine effort. That's. I mean, I am no authority on what the gods think, but that's what I think.
Yeah. You do have a chapter in your book, chapter 6, Magic and Esoteric Practices. So it looks like you do get into this topic.
Yes, and I talk about what I've tried to do in the book is to base what I'm saying as much as possible on historical components rather than personal beliefs. So it's like the historical background is a major component, but and then aside from that, the what I have observed broadly in many different people's practices. So I didn't want to push my version of being heathen too much on people. So I try to make clear when I say that this is how I think things should work. But when it comes to the esoterical magical practices, what I've tried to do is sort of like give a rundown of like a synthesis of what we know from the source material, and you can apply that in whichever way you think works, in my opinion. If you want to get really technical, we can start talking about the magical traditions, esoterical traditions that have existed in Europe, and still to some extent exist in Europe, and elsewhere on the African continent. There are many interesting ways of connecting with deities, what you could call ritual techniques that I think we could learn a lot from nowadays. One of the traditions that I have found seems very similar to historical heathenry are actually the West African voodoo practices, and that's for me as a scholar, that's just fascinating to observe. I think it was it's kind of been like 15 years ago. I picked up a book on West African traditions, and I was reading through it, and I was like, "Holy hell! Like that's that's almost like exactly what I have been reading in the source material from Scandinavia." you know, in, so in that sense, I think when it comes to like applying practices, modern practices, I think so many things can work. I think it's personally, I always think it's important to be grounded in historical tradition, um, but that doesn't mean that there is, in my opinion, any like right way to do it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'm curious. What is it in the practice of voodoo that you see that's similar to the way heathens would have practiced it? I don't think I've ever heard this comparison before. It's new on me.
So I would encourage anybody, including you, to check out Nordic Animism, a YouTube channel and also a Facebook page run by a scholar of um, West African and transatlantic um, um, African traditions in Denmark. His name is Rune Janu Rasmussen, and he has worked with both voodoo practices and with Nordic mythology for some time now. He's also the person behind the Nordic animist calendar, which is a very, very beautiful creation. So yeah, check out his stuff. But basically, what I realized when I was reading about the voodoo practices and also the pantheon is that the pantheon is very similar to um, the Scandinavian pantheon in many ways, and the structures of how worship has been structured, and the kingdom of Ife and all of this stuff uh, very much looks very similar to uh, how it looks like pre-Christian Scandinavian religion was practiced in that period from the 500s and up to the 700s. Um, so those are some of the aspects. And then you have a lot of ritual traditions in voodoo that we of course cannot verify whether or not that would have been similar, because we have very limited source material from Scandinavia. But it looks likely that there's a lot of similarities there. Of course, it's not because either of these traditions have the same source or anything like that. It simply looks like it's a common human way of being religious.
That's interesting. I'm going to look up that Nordic animism. I have said uh, many times over the last decade or more that I feel like almost it was African traditional religions who taught modern, like American pagans in particular, how to like connect with ancestors in a better way, and how to make offerings and interact in an animistic way with the world around you. So much of that I feel like was missing from like early '90s pagan, you know, content and material that was out there.
I think you're totally right. I mean, I think we have so much that we can learn from African traditions and indigenous traditions across the world.
Yep. Respectfully, please, everyone.
Respectfully, of course.
Respectfully, right?
That's why I said learn, not take.
Yeah. One thing I like to ask before we get too far, every place kind of has its own history, sort of haunted places, historically important places. You get into the idea of legend tripping. Some place that you've lived, what is like one of your favorite pieces of local folklore or historical site?
Oh, there's plenty.
I bet there are.
Okay. Okay. So there's one spot in Denmark and on the island of Zealand, which is incidentally also the island where you find Copenhagen, but on the diametrically opposite side of that island. So this is where one of aforementioned Viking King Harald Bluetooth he built a fortress. He built a bunch of fortresses to consolidate his power in Denmark in the late 980s. And it's reconstructed. There's a cute little like Viking site there now, and museum, and there's a huge, really awesome Viking market taking place every year. So I really suggest that anyone who plans to take a tourist trip to Denmark, do it around that time. Go there and check that out. But just north of there's a lake, and that lake is uh, named after the god Tyr. Um, so in Scandinavia, we still have, to some extent at least, discernible sacred place names. So place names that are named after the Nordic gods. Um, Anybody who knows Hans Christian Andersen, the Danish uh, fairy tale author who has written The Ugly Duckling and those fairy tales, might also know that he was from the Danish town of Odense, and that town name right there means Odin's holy site. Although it's been butchered by Danes for centuries now. And so, yeah, we have so many different sites in Denmark. And Denmark is the only place, except for one single island off the coast of Norway, where you find place names dedicated to the god Tyr. And this lake is called Tisø, so that means Tyr's Lake. And just next to it was a huge ritual site where, for several centuries in the Viking Age, people were coming there. They would have feasts in this grand hall. There would be a hörgur, this temple structure where they would make sacrifices to the gods. They would deposit all kinds of valuables and weaponry in the lake. The largest gold ring ever found from the Viking Age in Scandinavia has been found in that lake. And aside from that, this um, this little lake is also attached to a nice little folk tale. Um, the story goes that there's a town just north of the lake where there's a church, and there was a man who lived in that town. He traveled to another island where he incidentally ran into a troll that had lived in the area where Tisø is now. And that troll had moved because of the this infernal ringing of the bells that he could not stand. And so the troll wanted to get back at the minister at the church. So he gave he gave the man a letter addressed to the minister, just asked him, "Would you take this back to this town?" And the guy was like, "Yeah, sure, I could do that." And then he was traveling back, and as he was walking towards the town, he sat down at a meadow. And as he sat down and relaxed, he took out the letter. And as he opened the letter, because he got a little curious, of course, it's a folktale, um, he realized that water was pouring out of the letter. And all of a sudden, water had poured out and filled the entire area. And that's how Lake Teaser was created. So this the reason that I really like this site and the area in general is that it's so multi-layered. We have the scientific aspects, the archaeology, the recreated site. We have the natural space that is still there and has existed in some form or other since, forever. And then you have, it's been imbued with so much ritual power back in the Viking Age that, in the 19th century, they were still talking about that power, just now in a Christianized sense where they were demonizing it.
That sounds pretty cool. I definitely would like to visit Denmark someday. I know I've tracked a lot of my ancestry, and I know I have two lines in particular I've tracked into Denmark. So it's got relevance to my family somewhere along the way.
Yeah. It's a cute little country.
It's funny. I've been watching the series Last Kingdom. I've seen it before, and I've enjoyed the books too. And I'm just imagining, Uhtred coming in to talk to King Alfred and saying, "Yeah, the Danes come from a cute little country." They're cute little country invaders.
Yeah, no, it's. I have to admit, I really like the contrast of that Viking history and then what Denmark is now, because if anything, so my wife is originally from Chicago, so I'm very familiar with Illinois. We go there a lot. And
cool.
I'd say, if anything, you're going to get a smaller version of that whole Illinois, Iowa area when you go to Denmark. Though with a lot more coastline, of course.
That's not hard to achieve. Yeah. I shame on me for not even asking yet, but you can't get out of here until I do. It's a rule around here.
That's fair.
Have you ever seen a ghost or experienced a haunting?
Yes, I definitely have.
Score! Tell us the story.
So I think I've seen plenty of ghosts because that was the thing when I lived in Greenland. Nobody held back on their experiences with that stuff. And so nobody ever really suppressed anything in that regard. That was my experience as a child up there. So those listeners who aren't familiar with Greenland, it's populated by an indigenous people, Inuit. It is part of the Danish Commonwealth, and it is the largest colony that's still in existence. Like I'm ashamed to admit it, but my home country is a colonizing nation that still to this day possess Greenland. And Inuit culture is a very animist culture as well. And yeah, in that culture, ghosts are just a thing. Of course they are. You don't suppress that. So yeah, no, I remember in plenty of situations of seeing a ghost. In our in these cultures, maybe they're not as these stories might not be as exciting as they come out in American popular culture, but it was typically just like to see some kind of man, like where there was not supposed to be one, or a woman, in a place that would be odd, or somebody's face with light behind it showing up, in the mountains or something like that. Yeah, that's typically how it goes in the north. So yeah, that's those are my ghost experiences.
I like that. That's basically saying, "Have you ever seen a ghost?" And your response is, "You mean you haven't?"
Pretty much, yeah.
All right. We have come to the end of the regular portion of the show. How much fun has this been? Holy shit! You are such an awesome individual to talk to.
Oh, thank you so much. I've
You're
really enjoyed
welcome. Thank you. If is there something that you would like to talk about that we haven't gotten to that maybe I should have brought up and I didn't? Here would be a great part to put it in, or just share some parting thoughts.
it. Well, let's see. Uh, I I hope that with my background and what I've been saying in terms of like assessing how American heathens do their things and so on. I really hope I haven't offended anybody's uh, personal beliefs here. As I said before, I really hope that even if if you feel like uh, believing in the All Father, if that's a thing for you, you don't get discouraged just simply because I said that it might have been a Christian invention. Um, I want to really point out that I might have a fancy degree in Nordic mythology and written a book and also grown up as a heathen and all that stuff, but nobody out there, nobody is an authority on all of this stuff, and I think that's really important to point out that you create your personal beliefs as you see fit as a heathen, and you can listen to people that you find inspirational and that you find to be appropriate guides, but don't ever become the victim of gurus. I think that's the message that I would like to leave you all with.
Yeah, I like that. Don't ever become the victim of gurus. The sort of tongue-in-cheek first rule of heathenry, according to Ben Wagner, is you're doing it wrong.
Exactly.
So, all right.
And
Go ahead.
no, I just wanted to add, and we've I think we have all at some point in history, been that guy telling somebody else you're doing it wrong. But hopefully anybody who's out there doing that, I hope that they will get smarter.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I agree. And just be out there and find the way that it works for you, the personal expression that adds value to your life. Ultimately, if it is adding value to your life, I don't know how I can come along and shit on it. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. That wraps up the regular portion of the show. Matthias, thank you so much for giving us the time today. That was super appreciated.
Thank you
Where,
for inviting me.
yeah, where can people find you?
So you can find me on Instagram. Just find my name. I have my personal account there is sort of also a public account at this point. I also run the Nordic Mythology channel on Facebook, so you can find that's where I post videos that I make or other things that I do, and of course also the Nordic Mythology Podcast that I do with Daniel Farrand, the co-owner of Horns of Odin, a really cool company that I would encourage any heathen to check out because they have some really awesome clothes and drinking horns and all that stuff. Um, yeah, I also have my website, NordicMythologyChannel.com. where you can go read a little bit. I sometimes post a blog post or some other stuff on there. Yeah, so I think that's about it. Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. I'll make sure we get links and stuff to your website, Instagram, and whatnot, and of course your book in the show notes. So everyone
Great.
out there listening, thank you so much for tuning in. By this point, if you're a regular listener, you know the drill. For everyone new to the party, go to weirdwebradio.com, click join the membership, or go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio and come see just how morbid and weird we get in the world of stuff. And now he's folks. All right. Stay weird out there, my friends. And it is bonus audio time. Matthias, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
First question around here is always the same. What famous person's resting place would you most like to visit?
Oh, good question. What famous person's resting place?
Do you want to hear how they just answered that question? What famous person's resting place would you most like to visit? That and many others, including what they think about the afterlife, what they may or may not do in cemeteries, what are their traditions and magical practices that have to do with the dead, folklore that surrounds their homes, and so much more, available for only $5. $5 a month. Even if I make more than one episode in a month, it's still just $5 a month at patreon.com/weirdwebradio, or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. You can find me on Instagram at weirdwebradio. You can find me on Facebook as Weird Web Radio, or come join the new, fun and exciting Weird Web Radio Facebook group. Thank you again for being here. Stay weird out there, my friends.